On the last episode, we discussed how setting your goals up front will be the key to a successful rollout or implementation of any one of these projects. Those goals can be as simple as, I want to power my entire saltwater reef tank with the power of the sun. Or they can be as simple as, I just want to reduce my electrical bill because my fish tank is drawing too much electricity. Or, hey, maybe you want to take and use solar as a backup, so when the grid goes down, your fish tank is still up and running, right? Or that your fish tank and its inhabitants are able to survive a power outage. Again, all those are very key. Now with that, we also discussed the fact that you can use something like this kilowatt meter to actually put some numbers around those goals, right? So you can measure how much wattage you need to achieve those goals. And usually that will help you kind of narrow in on the size of your system and basically the costs around that. Now, with that, we also said that ultimately everybody's situation is different, meaning that nobody lives, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but most people don't live in the exact same longitude and latitude on this planet. So with that being said, what happens is you need to make sure that if you're lucky enough to find somebody that you can use as a reference, right, like as a baseline for your kind of setup, you need to make sure you tailor it for your particular situation. Meaning, maybe somebody lives in the same neighborhood as you, but they have a wooded lot versus yours is kind of wide open. Again, maybe somebody lives in the same town, maybe they live in the same state, same country, etc. You have to adjust those, I'll say, requirements based on your environment, yours specifically, because it does change dramatically. And we also discussed about how you can use different kind of tools to basically harvest that energy, store that energy, and use it. Which brings us in today's topic, or to today's topic, solar generators. Since we aired that last video, several viewers reached out to me and asked if I could define or go into solar generators a little more before getting into the larger systems, the whole house solar kind of systems. And that's what we are going to do on today's episode of American Reef. So what exactly is a solar generator? Well, think of it this way. It's a tool that will allow you to capture energy and store it for use at a later date. Sounds a lot like a battery, right? Well, it is a battery, but there's so much more, right? And I'll say that so much more can be defined in like three areas. Number one, the input, right? Where does it get its power? So a rechargeable battery, for example, you plug it into a wall outlet, let it charge up. The power software says, hey, I'll monitor this thing. When it's full, I'll shut it off, right? And you go from there. Well, a solar generator does the exact same thing, only not only can you take the power from your outlet or the grid, but you also can get your power from the sun. Right? Again, so that's a big difference. The second item, how's it used, right? How is that power used? Well, again, with rechargeable batteries, etc., those are DC or direct current, right, kind of devices, and that's what you get. But with a solar generator, what happens is you can also plug anything that you plug into your wall, for example, or a wall outlet. You can plug it into the solar generator and power it up. Now again, there are some parameters around that, meaning the amount of energy it uses, etc. And we'll talk about those in the future. But just think of it this way, a solar generator allows you to plug in normal appliances that you would normally plug in to your grid or to your wall outlets to get that. Third, and probably most importantly, right, there's a lot of, we'll say, safety features that are included into a solar generator that you just don't get without a lot of trouble or a lot of work, right, in kind of, we'll say, DIY kind of systems. Meaning that we've all heard horror stories about batteries exploding, etc., right? Well, the technologies that they use, for example, to manage things like that fall into that safety category. Whether it's the type of battery, right? We know lithium-ion batteries may or may not have issues, as well as it can only be charged so many times, right? Well, the lithium iron phosphate batteries, for example, again, less prone to safety issues and can be charged like 10x of what a lithium ion can. While you're doing this, you got to monitor temperature, for example, because you can't let the temperature get out of whack or bad things happen. So there are things like that that ultimately allow you to safely store that energy that you're going to use, on your reef tank. Now, with that being said, how do we start this whole thing, right? Well, again, my goal is to create a use case for a smaller solar generator. So what does that look like? Well, in my mind, the most common kind of scenario that we run into is I want to be able to withstand a 24-hour power outage. Nothing more, nothing less, right? So what does that mean in my case? Well, in my particular case, when I say withstand a 24-hour power outage, what I mean is I just want to make sure that the organisms are staying alive for 24 hours, right? So, like, for example, even though I have corals in my tank, corals can go days without light, no big deal. Fish, on the other hand, they don't need light at all. I mean, they do, but you get the idea in a short-term kind of scenario. All those other kind of things I just don't care about. What I really care about is, hey, is there oxygen getting into the water? Is the water temperature okay, right? Is it survivable? And number three, if possible, can I get any filtration in there, right? I'm a big fan of, again, the fish not swimming around in their own kind of excrement, so to speak. So with that being said, let's kind of roll that back a little bit. As far as oxygen in the water, normally you break the surface tension to get that, right? So that means you have a circulating pump up high. If you go with something like an Ecotech with a battery backup, they basically put the battery backup up on top, or excuse me, the MP up on top, right? And then when the power's cut, the battery kicks in and it circulates. So to me, that's the primary goal. As far as temperature, again, I want it within a range, meaning I don't need this thing to be optimal. I'm only trying to keep my organisms alive. So what does that mean? We'll say on the low side, high 60s. On the high side, maybe low 80s, right? So I want the ability to kind of heat the water as well. And then as far as the filtration, again, I would love to have a skimmer in this thing. Again, to me, it's very beneficial to help basically not only aerate the water, but also filter the water, right? And get those dissolveds out of there, those organics that are only hurting. And so that is my use case. So how did I go back to use my kilowatt meter to measure that use case? Well, basically what I did is I plugged the kilowatt meter into my return pump. I plugged the kilowatt meter into my heater, and I also plugged it into again, the skimmer to see what kind of energy requirements I'm going to have. And at the end of the day, literally it was a 24-hour window, right? Basically it looks like those 3 items in my current setup use about 500 watts an hour, or translate it to 12 kilowatt hours in a day period. So that's my mark, right? Meaning now all I need to do is go get a system, right, that can support 12 kilowatt hours. So 12,000 watts was my goal. And just to be honest about this, this is actually a real scenario. It's how I actually got down into that solar path, right? Basically, this was my scenario, and this is how it played out, so to speak, right? Which kind of brought us to this video today. So again, 12,000 watts or 12 kilowatt hours. I went out and I started looking at the 12 kilowatt hour systems. And then I was shell shocked. I could not believe how expensive they were. And to give you an idea, if you go to the Department of Energy, right, and you look at their statistics, what they will tell you is for any kind of solar system, on average, you're going to spend anywhere between $2.50 a watt all the way up to like $3.20, something like that. Right? So either way, when you look at $2.50 times 12,000 watts, that's way more than I wanted to spend it, and just off the charts. So I thought about it for a while, right? And I thought, well, hey, you know, campers, they're powering, right? They're using power when they're off grid. How do they do it? And that actually got me down to the solar generator path. Now, don't get me wrong, with the solar generators, when I looked for a 12 kilowatt hour system, it was still thousands. Don't get me wrong, it was probably a third of the cost, right, of, we'll say, a traditional system. However, it's still way more than I wanted to spend. Right? So I thought about it a little bit more, right, and I thought, well, you know what? I like the concept of, you know, that kind of solar generator and how it works. You know, what's my limit? What kind of dollars do I want to spend on this thing? So I just went out and I looked at, again, an Ecotech MP with a battery backup. Now, the Ecotech MP with a battery backup, I figured about 500 bucks would be a good, just average price, right? So that was my mark, right? So I'm like, what can I get for about $500? So I looked at it and I chose the Jackery 1000, right? Now, again, there are all kind of other products out there, like I said, EcoFlow, Anchor, there's a ton of them. I just chose Jackery because I like the name, right? It came from, what was it, the movie The Incredibles by Disney, little Jack, right? Apparently somebody liked them. They had good reviews. I'm like, we'll start there, let's see where it goes. So with that being said, Explorer 1000. Well, what did that get me? Well, what it did is it got me basically 1,000 watts or 1 kilowatt hour with a surge capacity of about 1,500 watts. Surges meaning when you start motors up and things like that, you have a spike or a peak and then it kind of drops down, right? So it'll allow a 1,500 watt spike and then it'll drop down to 1,000. So again, when you look at it and you look at the 12 kilowatt hours, that doesn't match. So what I had to do is kind of, I don't want to say reverse engineer, but basically that was it. Let's back into that, you know. How can I keep my organisms alive for a 24-hour period, right? While at the same time sticking to that kind of $500 number or 1,000 watts, depending on how you slice it. Thought about it and I thought, well, how does Ecotech do it, right? I mean, I looked at their systems, $500, why don't I just get one of those, right? And at the end of the day, you know, after looking how they did it, basically what they do is they take their MP when there's a power outage, they drop the power down and they allow for like a 10% or 20%, again, kind of power. And then from there, they get just perfectly acceptable / great run times out of that because it's using less power, but you're still breaking the surface area kind of thing, right? So at the end of the day, I looked at that and said, well, if they do that, I should be able to do that with what I've got floating around the house, so to speak. Looked around and I said, I'm a big fan of Tunze, right? Let's try this 6020 nanostream, right? And I'm like, how many watts does that produce? This little guy is 4 watts. And I'm like, ooh, with 4 watts, you know, you do the math on 1,000, you're like, man, that gets me way past the 1 day, right? It's going to use about, what, 100 watts a day? That means that gives me 10 days. That's pretty good, right? So I've got my I've got my circulation problem solved, and I've got around 900 watts to spare. So with that, I looked at it and said, well, let's see heaters. Man, did that throw me through another loop, because most heaters, again, are hundreds of watts. And in my situation, again, if you're looking at around a 150-gallon tank, a 300-watt heater, it's going to draw a lot of power. And so that'll just wipe me out. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, again, I have my range, high 60s to low 80s, so this is only going to happen in the wintertime. So I'm like, okay, in the wintertime is probably when I'll need that heater the most. And cooling it, I'm not too worried about it just yet. And again, it has so many different factors, whether it was, again, the seasons, you know, if it was a sunny day, a warm day, you know, all those kind of things. And ultimately, I thought to myself, well, I think for the heating of the water, right, and I'm just going to put cooling off to the side for now. The heating of the water, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let that go, right, and let's see what else comes about. Then I thought, well, how can I oxygenate the water? How can I get some filtration going? And I got back and said, hey, I know that, again, Tunze has, again, a very, I'll say, energy efficient line of skimmers meant for little tanks. And I happen to have, again, this 9004, right? I guess it's 9004, but either way, I had this bad boy, and it uses 4 watts. And I looked at it and said, well, this is a skimmer that will not only oxygenate the water, but it will also allow a little bit of circulation. So with a tag team of, again, the 9004 and the 6020 nanostream, I pretty much got 2 of my, I'll say, goals hit, right? And together, they would use approximately, you know, maybe 20% of the power. So that meant out of 1,000 watts, right, basically 200 watts would be used for circulating and skimming, and then I had 800 watts to use sparingly, right, for heating the water. Now, ultimately, the scenario that I came up with was, for the heater, I would do that manually, not doing anything automatic about it, because what it would allow me to do is I would take out the whole refugium out of the picture, and I would only power the display, right? So I'm saving lots of energy all the way through it. And either way, by doing it manually, I thought, well, okay, if I was doing it manually, what I could do is, if it was a cold winter day, very simply, I would take and cover the top to prevent the heat loss, and I would still use both items, but at the same time, I'd get the oxygen not from the breaking the surface, because again, I'd be covering that up. I'd get that by the skimming. So it achieved that end result for me, and at the same time, it provided a lot more. So what does a lot more look like? Well, the 3 areas for me that I found a lot of value, right, were number 1, and most important, I could plug solar panels into this thing, right? And from a solar perspective, it would allow me to basically charge using solar panels, and it would accept up to 200 watts. So again, 200 watts an hour, that would help me offset the heater issue that I had. Or again, if I ran out of power, I could plug in some solar panels and again, and basically get that energy versus, again, a traditional battery, or kind of like in the ecotech world, I'd have to basically take that battery and either have another one as backup and go out somewhere to charge it and bring it back, or, you know, you get the idea. Having the solar was very convenient for me. You know, the other thing that it allowed was basically allowed me to plug in anything else that I wanted to do. So if I wanted to run maybe an LED or several LEDs or several, again, kind of circulating pumps, I had the ability just to plug them in, which was nice, and I like that functionality. So I don't want to say that I could run this thing indefinitely, right? But if there are sunny days, I can really extend it, and it blows out my 24-hour number dramatically. You know, lastly, one of the other things that I really liked about solar generators was the fact that you could plug other things into them, as far as USB things, right? Whether it was your phones, whether it was, you know, again, other batteries that you have for lights. Again, anything that has that USB, most of them are A and C, right? But if it has that connector at the end, you can just plug it in and pull it that way. And again, not that that was in any of my goals, but for me, I saw that as a value. Right? And then lastly, the other thing that I thought was, these things are handheld. And again, this is a smaller unit, but even the 1000, it's just small, right? So you can pick it up, take it down the road, charge it up, and bring it back. When I say take it down the road, I mean, you know, whatever. Take it to a family member. Take it to somewhere where you can get, an AC outlet in the wall, and it charges in a few hours. That kind of thing. You know, it allowed me that option. So again, for my 24-hour window, that was something that I really liked, and it gave me flexibility, because I'm all about that flexibility thing, because you never know what comes up, so to speak. And in general, that's what actually got me down into the solar generators, as well as, again, the use case that this allowed me to solve. When I say this, I mean the solar generators allowed me to solve. So to that point, let's kind of talk a little bit about solar generators, right? And some of the, I'll say, higher points that you want to consider when you're selecting a solar generator. Now, there are several factors you need to consider when matching up your solar generator with kind of your goals, your desires, your outcomes. We're going to review some of what I think are the major ones, but there's all kind of like spider webs in this thing, meaning that it kind of forks off and branches. And we'll get into those, like most likely later on in the videos, as we kind of dive into those topics. The first major category, we've already been talking about it, right? It's storage capacity. So when you look at it, the idea is simple. I selected, in my example, a Jackery 1000 because it had 1,000 watts of storage capacity, or 1 kilowatt hour. And in my example, I said, hey, if I went with a 60/20 nanostream, ultimately it would use 4 watts every hour. What that meant was basically after 10 hours, it would use 40 watts, right? After, again, 20 hours, 80 watts. So the math is relatively simple, right? 1,000 minus whatever makes it work. Now, in my case, I also added the skimmer, so that 4 watts became 8 watts an hour. So again, 8 watts an hour means in 10 hours it's going to draw 80 watts. 20 hours, 160, you get the idea. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, meaning there are some nuances to that storage capacity. Basically, there's overhead, and that overhead's going to draw power from the battery, which means just because you can store 1,000 watts doesn't mean you can use 1,000 watts. Now, in general, a good number to use is 20%, meaning assume like a 20% overhead factor. So in my example of the Jackery 1000, 20% of that is actually 200. So that means I've got about 800 watts of power that I can use, again, for my, draw or my output or, the filters, whatever you want to call that. And there's 20% that is going to be overhead. And again, that will depend, right, as far as, what kind of features you have on your solar generator. Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, those things, again, to be accessible 24 hours or remotely, they require, power. That power comes from the battery. You have an inverter in it. That inverter's got to convert basically, DC to AC or, some version thereof it. And again, where is it going to get its power? From the battery. So ultimately, if you go with that 20% number, it'll give you a good idea of how much, we'll say, battery storage wattage you actually can use or get out of that solar generator. Now, again, as far as those categories go, when you think about it, the next major category is how does that wattage actually get into the solar generator? So you have to think about the input values. Ultimately, input, again, has some nuances to it, but you have to think about it. As far as input goes, how many watts can it take and how fast can it take it? And then where does it come from, right? So for example, you can have solar generators that only work by getting their power from, the grid or your household, so to speak, or from the wall outlet, however you want to define that. You have other ones that maybe are just pulling it solar only. Some use USB, right? Some will do a combination of all three. So at the end of the day, it's kind of like you want to make sure that it will provide you the ability to harvest the energy, the energy from the sun the way you want to. Now again, there are nuances to that, meaning you have capacity numbers, but you also have basically how much can it accept at one time, right? And again, that's important because in an emergency, if your unit can handle, we'll say, 2,000 watts an hour input, right, versus a unit that can handle 1,000 watts an hour, well, it's going to take you double the time to charge the lower unit, and maybe that won't be acceptable for your use case. So you have to look at it and say, okay, input-wise, how does that work, right? Do I have what I need to charge it in the time frame that I want to charge it with the input source? Again, grid, solar, etc. Along those lines, a third area you want to look at is your output, right? Again, full of nuances, but from an output standpoint, you can look at it as two kind of major categories. One is what's your continuous draw of wattage from the solar generator, and then number two, what's your surge, right? For most things that have a motor, there's a surge, right? It takes whatever energy it needs to kind of spin that thing around, whatever that thing is, and then from there, it'll drop down a little bit. So like in my particular case, right, with the Tunzes, when you look at this 4 watts, well, maybe to start it up, instead of just drawing 4, that surge, it's going to need like 6 to 8 watts. But then after it gets started, well, we're okay, we're cruising at 4. But if you have something like one of the MPs or anything that kind of pulses, where you're having surge, constant, and again, with that in mind, those are hard to measure how much you need. That's why, again, in my particular case, I just went with something constant. That way it's reliable. I know the wattage that I'm going to get across, and I don't need a ton of it anyway. So to that point, the features that you get with these surge kind of pumps, in an emergency situation, they're not necessarily needed. So, again, for planning purposes, I like going with something that's constant. Now, again, as far as nuances go, right, besides that constant and surge, you have to figure out, well, when I actually go to cut this thing over, do I need to do it manually or does it have to be automatic? If it's automatic, do I want to go UPS or do I want to go EPS? right? And when you look at a UPS, on an uninterruptible power supply, and EPS is just the emergency version of that. And I believe UPS, it'll cut over in less than 10 milliseconds, and EPS, I believe it's less than 30 milliseconds. So again, as you're looking for a solar generator, you got to look and say, does it have that feature that you want? Meaning, do you want it to cut over automatically? And if it does, will it do it in the time frame that you need? And again, those are all kind of related, but again, very important as it relates to some of the factors, right? Now, battery chemistry is another area that you want to consider, right? Ultimately, when you look at solar generators, you'll see there's two types of battery chemistries. One is lithium ion, which is the same lithium ion that we have in our smartphones, etc., right? And then you have your LiFePO4, or your lithium iron phosphate. Right? Now, when you look at it, the reason why most of the solar generators are either at or are going to the LiFePO4 batteries is for two kind of areas. Number one, charge cycles. Right, a charge cycle, basically, when you take a battery from 0 to 100, that's a charge cycle. If you take it from 50 to 100, that's half of a charge cycle. So you get the idea. When you look at lithium ion, right, those charge cycles will be measured in the hundreds. And when I say hundreds, I mean low hundreds, like 300, 400, 500. And again, it depends on the technology that you go after and what's being used. However, that's roughly what you'll get out of a lithium ion battery. Now, your LiFePO4 battery at a 0, meaning that you're looking more at the thousands. Whether it's 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, you get the idea. You get a lot more charge cycles with your LiFePO4 batteries than you do with your lithium ion. So that's one key consideration of why everybody's using it. Second one, it's safer, right? Ultimately, the LiFePO4 batteries can handle heat a lot better, right? They're more stable. So you have a product that is, again, safer, and at the end of the day has way more charge cycles before you get that kind of 80% spent battery thing. That's a good thing. And you know, that's why a lot of people and companies are actually moving to it. Now, since we're talking about batteries, the next thing you got to consider is, do you want a solar generator that is expandable? Meaning that, you know, can you add external batteries to this thing? Now, in a future episode, I'm going to show you basically a 2 kilowatt hour system. That what I did is I added two 2 kilowatt hour batteries that are external. So that took my 2 kilowatt hour system and made it a 6 kilowatt hour system. And again, in general, all the other things like your inputs and your outputs kind of stayed the same. Time changed a bit, right, because it takes more time now to charge these batteries. However, the main benefit is the fact that I got a lot more capacity now, right? 6 kilowatt hour versus 2 kilowatt hour. So in general, as far as batteries go, right, it's important to kind of focus on those three areas and get what you need, want, desire, so to speak, to, again, hit your goals. So another area to consider is the software, meaning some solar generators will come with software that will allow you to monitor your solar generator's usage as well as control your solar generator. In the monitoring category, I've seen them where it's as basic as measuring your input, right? How many watts you're getting in, whether it's from solar panels to, you know, the grid, to your output, right? How many watts are going out? When will you run out? How much power did you use in a day or a week, a month? You know, again, a lot of monitoring / reporting functionality that they'll have in that software. On the control side, all kind of areas like, for example, there are some software packages that I saw out there, again, that come from the manufacturers, that will allow you to control when the solar generator will charge. Maybe, for example, you're charging it from the grid and you want to make sure you have, we'll say, cheaper prices at night versus expensive electricity during the day. Well, you can set it up so it only charges at night. Same as something simple like the charging speed. So you can control the speed at which, the input, right, or the watts get, jammed in that solar generator. Meaning there might be a storm coming, right? And what you want to do is you want to get it in there as fast as you can. So you set it to, again, fast charging. Or maybe what you want to do is you want to save the battery, right? You want to kind of extend its life, so you want to do that slower trickle charge. So you set the setting to a slower charge, right? Again, lots of different features and functions that we'll dive into later episodes. But ultimately, when you look at it, software is kind of an important feature of these solar generators. And does it get you what you need and want? The ability to monitor that solar generator remotely anywhere on the planet, I find invaluable. I really, 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 really like that. So to that point, though, there's a lot more to it. We'll get into it in future episodes as well. We'll kind of dive into the tiers, right? Meaning that most solar generators come in, I'll say, t-shirt sizes or categories, right? You know how your shirts, you have like extra small, small, medium, large, extra large. Well, you kind of have that with solar generators. We'll dive into that in a later episode, but just know that that exists. And from a criteria perspective, if, like in my particular case, if you want to start small and then go big, it will help kind of knowing what big looks like and what small looks like. Now, before we sign off, another category. Portability. Now, you've heard me talk about that Jackery 1000, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually show you what that looks like and why I mentioned portability. Because in my criteria, what I wanted to do is I wanted something that was portable. Again, one of the criterias, one of the goals. And this right here is that Jackery 1000. This is an older version. They have newer versions. This one here is actually lithium ion versus, again, the LiFePO4 batteries. That being said, for my purposes, it kind of served its need, and it allowed me to educate myself enough so that I could figure out, okay, where do I want to go in these t-shirt sizes to basically, come without, I don't want to say my final configuration, but at least something that will allow to get me to where I want to be and now and where I want to be in the future. So again, a Jackery 1000, as you can see, very portable. And this little guy here is a 240, right? And so again, this one has 1,000 watts, this one has 240. And don't forget the fact that you don't get all of that, right? There's a factor that you have to consider, right? 20%-ish overhead. So you'll be able to get 80% of that. But again, you'll see that this is kind of like extra small, and then this would be considered small. And in future episodes, what we will do is we'll go over your mediums, your larges, and extra larges. Till then, you've heard me say many times, give my sponsors a chance to earn that business. Who are they? Bulk Supply, Premium Aquatics, Tunze, right? Ecosystems. Great guys that deserve a chance to earn your business. I'm Russ Kickel, and thanks for watching this episode of American Reef.